The world was never prepared for moments like this, the kind of moments that don't come with fanfare or flashing lights but arrive quietly, like a single drop of rain that sets off a flood. The chosen one didn't come with a thunderous announcement. No prophecy carved into ancient stones foretold their arrival. They simply were. Their presence was not loud, nor was it grandiose. Instead, it was felt, a gravitational pull that disrupted the space around them. People couldn't quite describe it, but they could sense it deep in their bones, a vibration that shook something loose in their hearts. It was as if the air itself shifted when they were near, heavy with a meaning no one could quite put into words. Some would later describe it as a force, an unrelenting energy that demanded to be noticed. Others would call it divine, a glimpse of something sacred amidst the mundane. But in those first fleeting moments, no one had words for it. There was only silence, a collective pause in the chaotic rhythm of life. A man named Ethan Caldwell, a seasoned journalist who had chased stories across war zones and city riots, was among the first to encounter this presence. He stood frozen, camera dangling around his neck, his breath caught somewhere in his throat. It wasn't fear that held him still. It was reverence. "Do you feel that?" he muttered to his colleague Maria Torres, a sharp-eyed photographer known for capturing raw humanity through her lens. Maria didn't respond. She was staring ahead, her camera forgotten in her hands. Ethan followed her gaze, and there, standing amidst the crowd, unassuming yet undeniably magnetic, was the chosen one. They weren't speaking, weren't moving, yet their very existence commanded attention. In those first precious seconds, no one could tear their eyes away. It wasn't beauty or charisma that held them captive. It was truth. A raw, unfiltered truth that seemed to emanate from the chosen one like light from a lantern in a pitch-black room. But truth, as beautiful as it can be, is also uncomfortable. And as the stillness stretched on, the crowd began to shift uneasily. Some whispered in awe, others averted their eyes as if they'd seen something they weren't supposed to. A child, no older than 7, clutched her mother's hand and pointed. "Mommy, they look sad and happy at the same time." Her mother knelt down, her voice trembling. "Shh, baby. Just look." Ethan raised his camera, his seasoned hands shaking slightly as he focused the lens. Click. The shutter snapped shut, capturing not just an image but a moment, a single, frozen instant that would ripple out across the world in ways no one could predict. Maria whispered under her breath, her voice heavy with something Ethan couldn't quite identify. "What are we supposed to do with this?" But there was no answer. The chosen one didn't offer explanations or grand gestures. They simply were, a presence so profound that it felt like standing at the edge of an endless ocean, staring into a horizon that refused to end. The first encounter ended as abruptly as it began. The chosen one turned and walked away, vanishing into the crowd like smoke dispersing into the wind. But the silence they left behind lingered, clinging to every surface, every heart. As Ethan lowered his camera and Maria exhaled a breath she didn't realize she was holding, one undeniable truth remained. Nothing would ever be the same again. The image went viral before anyone could truly comprehend its weight. Ethan Caldwell's photograph of the chosen one, a single frame capturing an indescribable presence, spread like wildfire across every corner of the digital world. There was something inexplicable about it. It wasn't just a picture, it was a window into something larger. The chosen one wasn't smiling or frowning. They weren't performing or posing. They simply were. And yet, in their stillness, there was movement, an undercurrent of meaning that seemed to bypass the rational mind and strike straight at the soul. People stared at the photo for minutes, hours even, their eyes tracing every detail. The soft light reflecting off their face, the faint crease of their brow, the weight of knowing in their gaze. Social media lit up with questions, theories, and debates. Who were they? What did they mean? But most importantly, why did this image make people feel so much? In a modest apartment in Seattle, Grace Evans, a high school teacher with a bookshelf full of poetry and a heart perpetually heavy with unspoken worries, stared at the image on her phone. Her tea had gone cold an hour ago, forgotten beside her. She whispered to herself, "Why does it feel like they're looking through me?" Grace wasn't the only one feeling this way. In New York, Chicago, and San Francisco, in tiny rural towns and sprawling suburban neighborhoods, people stopped in their tracks. At bus stops, in coffee shops, and on late-night subway rides. They stared at the image and felt seen. It wasn't logical. The chosen one wasn't speaking, wasn't explaining, and yet their presence carried a weight that disrupted the ordinary flow of thought. People felt stripped bare, as if the image had peeled away their carefully constructed facades, leaving them vulnerable and real. News outlets picked up the story within hours. Headlines flashed across screens. The image that stopped the world. Who is the chosen one? A presence that defies explanation. But while journalists, pundits, and self-proclaimed experts scrambled to analyze, decode, and own the meaning of the image, something deeper was happening in quiet corners of the world. A teenager in Ohio set down his gaming controller and stared at the photo on his cracked phone screen. His chest felt tight, his eyes burned. He hadn't spoken to his father in weeks after a bitter argument, but now, without knowing why, he found himself dialing his dad's number. An elderly woman in Florida, sitting alone in a dusty armchair surrounded by old photo albums, felt her heart swell as she stared into the chosen one's eyes. Tears traced quiet paths down her wrinkled cheeks. She whispered into the empty room, "I wish you could see this, Harold." And in a bustling newsroom, Ethan Caldwell watched the frenzy unfold from his desk. Maria Torres stood beside him, her camera strap tangled around her wrist. "They're trying to explain it, Ethan," Maria said softly. "But this isn't something you can explain." Ethan nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the screen where his photograph was plastered across a breaking news banner. "No, it isn't. You don't explain something like this. You feel it." But for every person moved to tears or introspection, there were others who resisted. Online debates grew vicious. Skeptics scoffed, dismissing the phenomenon as mass hysteria. A prominent talk show host mocked the photograph on live television, calling it just another viral trick of the internet. And yet, the ripple continued. The chosen one's image wasn't just seen, it was felt. Like a pebble dropped into still water, its effects radiated outward, touching lives in ways both profound and subtle. Some people felt hope, others felt fear, but no one, not a single person who encountered that image, felt nothing. Somewhere in the world, the chosen one walked unseen through crowded streets, their presence unassuming but undeniable. They did not seek the world's attention, but the world was now reaching for them, desperate for answers to questions they didn't know how to ask. And in countless hearts, one quiet, unshakable thought took root. This changes everything. The image of the chosen one continued to spread, bypassing algorithms and breaking records across every platform. It wasn't just viral, it was inevitable. People couldn't look away, couldn't stop talking about it, and most importantly, couldn't stop feeling it. But where there is light, shadows are sure to follow. In a crowded newsroom in Manhattan, Ethan Caldwell sat at his desk, his eyes scanning endless headlines flashing across his monitor. Words like Messiah, Zrania, hoax, Zrania, and global phenomenon screamed back at him. Across from him, Maria Torres scrolled through the comment sections of their own published story. "This isn't just fascination anymore, Ethan," Maria said, her voice low but urgent. "People are dividing. It's like they're afraid of what they're seeing. Fear, awe, resentment. The image had unleashed something raw in people, something that couldn't be controlled. For every person moved to tears, there was another who felt threatened, exposed." In a sleek glass skyscraper across the city, Leonard Hayes, a well-known media mogul, slammed his fist against his mahogany desk. His assistant flinched. "This stops now," Leonard roared, his face flushed with anger. "This thing is disrupting everything. People are asking questions they have no business asking. We can't let chaos win." Chaos. That's what the Chosen One represented to people like Leonard. An unpredictable force, a mirror reflecting uncomfortable truths. Meanwhile, in a humble church basement in Ohio, Pastor Elijah Carter knelt in prayer before an altar. His congregation had been buzzing about the Chosen One for days, their voices tinged with hope, fear, and something close to reverence. "Lord," Pastor Carter whispered, his hands trembling as he clutched a worn Bible, "if this is your messenger, if this is your hand at work, give me the wisdom to guide your people." Out on the streets, murals of the Chosen One began to appear, on brick walls, subway tunnels, and abandoned buildings. Some were painted with halos of light, others with shadows creeping in from the edges. Each mural told a different story, reflecting the artist's own interpretation, their own struggle to understand, but not everyone painted with reverence. Graffiti began to scrawl across the Chosen One's likeness: fraud, liar, false prophet. In a neon-lit diner in Los Angeles, Ava Bennett, a college student and part-time waitress, sat across from her best friend, scrolling through endless threads of online debates. "Why do people hate them so much?" Ava asked, her brow furrowed. "They haven't done anything wrong." Her friend shrugged, sipping her milkshake. "Because they can't explain them, Ava, and people hate what they can't explain." Outside the diner window, a television screen mounted on a neighboring building played a live debate. A prominent political analyst's voice boomed through the speakers. "This so-called Chosen One is dangerous. You can't just let someone or something have this kind of unchecked influence over society. It's a recipe for disaster." The reactions were splintering: awe, envy, fear, and outright resistance. Each emotion created ripples, colliding and amplifying the others. People began to draw lines in the sand. Believers on one side, skeptics on the other, and the indifferent caught somewhere in between. But in the middle of the noise, amidst the shouting matches on television and the angry comment threads online, there were still moments of stillness. In small corners of the world, people sat quietly with the image of the Chosen One glowing on their screens. A mother in Nebraska held her newborn baby and stared at the photo, tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "Please, please let this mean something good." A soldier stationed overseas shared the image with his comrades during a brief lull in their mission. They sat in silence, staring at the photo as distant gunfire echoed in the background. And far away from all the chaos, the Chosen One walked, quiet, unseen, untouched by the storm they had unintentionally created. The world was dividing, breaking apart along fault lines of belief, fear, and hope. And yet, amidst the fractures, one undeniable truth remained. Everyone was watching. Everyone was waiting. For what? No one knew. But the question lingered in the air, heavy and unspoken. What happens next? The world was no longer the same. The image of the Chosen One had become more than just a photograph. It was a symbol, a catalyst, a question mark etched into the fabric of society. And, like moths drawn to a flame, people couldn't resist searching for answers. But this wasn't ordinary curiosity. This was something deeper, an ache, a hunger to make sense of the unexplainable. People weren't just seeking the Chosen One. They were seeking themselves in the reflection of that presence. In a quiet corner of her high school classroom, Grace Evans, the teacher from Seattle, stood by the window, watching rain streak across the glass. Behind her, her students were supposed to be working on essays, but most of them sat staring at their phones. The Chosen One's image glowed on their screens. "Miss Evans," a voice broke the silence. A boy named Liam, shy and often overlooked, raised his hand. Do you think they're real? I mean, really real?" Grace turned to face him, her expression soft yet heavy with uncertainty. I think sometimes the most real things are the ones we can't explain, Liam." Across the world, search parties formed, not the physical kind with flashlights and maps, but digital pilgrimages. Chat rooms filled with theories. Private forums buzzed with whispers. Some people claimed to have seen the chosen one in distant cities. Others swore they felt their presence in dreams. In a small library in Chicago, Oliver Raines, a philosophy professor on the verge of retirement, sat hunched over stacks of dusty books. He had spent his entire career trying to decode meaning, through Plato, Aristotle, Kant, and yet here he was, staring at a digital image on his laptop, utterly speechless. "What happens," he murmured to himself, "when the answer doesn't come in words?" His assistant, a bright young graduate student named Hannah, walked in and placed a cup of coffee beside him. "Professor Raines, maybe it's not about answers. Maybe it's about the questions they make us ask." Oliver looked up at her, his tired eyes glistening with something close to awe. "Perhaps you're right, Hannah. Perhaps they're the question itself." Meanwhile, others took a different path. The search wasn't about understanding. It was about control. In a dimly lit conference room, Leonard Hayes sat surrounded by advisors and security personnel. Maps and grainy screenshots of supposed sightings were pinned to a board. "They can't just wander the world unchecked," Leonard barked, slamming his fist on the table. "Who are they? What do they want? Someone find them." But the chosen one wasn't hiding. They weren't evading detection or slipping through shadows. They simply existed, walking unnoticed in crowded places, passing people on park benches and busy sidewalks. And yet no one could truly see them unless they were ready to. In a small diner just outside Atlanta, a waitress named Samantha was refilling coffee cups when the doorbell jingled. A stranger walked in, calm, unassuming, carrying nothing but an air of quiet stillness. Samantha paused, her hand hovering over a coffee pot, her breath catching in her throat. For a split second, their eyes met. And in that fleeting moment, Samantha felt as if every worry, every fear, every scar etched into her soul was laid bare, and somehow accepted. The stranger smiled faintly, nodded, and walked out the door. Samantha's knees felt weak as she leaned against the counter, her eyes brimming with tears. She couldn't explain it, couldn't describe it, but deep down in her core, she knew. They were here. The search wasn't about finding the chosen one. It was about recognizing them. It wasn't about explanations or answers. It was about being ready to see them, to feel them, to understand them. And while some people chased shadows and others scribbled theories on whiteboards, a few, just a precious few, stopped. They paused. They listened to the stillness in their own hearts and realized the chosen one wasn't hiding from them. They were hiding from themselves. The world was searching, but the real question remained. Would they know the truth when they finally found it? The search for the chosen one had become more than just an effort to understand. It had become an obsession. Governments, corporations, religious leaders, and everyday people all seemed to be chasing something they couldn't name, couldn't touch, couldn't hold. But the chosen one was not a puzzle to be solved. They were a truth, raw, uncontainable, and untamed. In a sprawling government facility deep in Virginia, Agent Marcus Hale, a seasoned intelligence officer with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes, stood in front of a wall covered with photos, maps, and scattered documents. Red strings connected dots on a chaotic web of uncertainty. His junior officer, Riley Carter, shuffled nervously beside him. "Sir, every lead we've followed has gone cold. It's like they're everywhere and nowhere at the same time." Marcus stared at the chaotic mosaic in front of him, his jaw tight. "You can't trap the wind in a box, Riley, and you can't contain something that refuses to be defined." Meanwhile, in a quiet park in San Francisco, Evelyn Myers, a retired nurse with soft, wrinkled hands and eyes full of kindness, sat on a wooden bench. She watched the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink. Beside her sat a stranger, calm, quiet, their presence blending seamlessly into the golden light. "I lost my son last year," Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of unspoken grief. "He was only 35. I keep asking myself if I could have done something different, if I could have saved him." The stranger turned to her, their gaze steady and filled with something Evelyn couldn't quite name. Peace? Understanding? Love? "You carry so much, Evelyn," the stranger said softly, "but it's not yours to carry alone." Tears spilled down Evelyn's cheeks as her shoulders shook with quiet sobs. When she looked up again, the stranger was gone, vanished into the fading light. But Evelyn felt lighter, as though an invisible weight had been lifted from her chest. Back in the centers of power, frustration was boiling over. Leonard Hayes paced the floor of his boardroom, his voice sharp and filled with venom. "They can't just walk through the world, disrupting everything without consequences. We must regain control of this narrative." But how do you control something that exists beyond definitions, beyond borders, beyond the limitations of language and logic? The chosen one wasn't leading rallies, wasn't delivering speeches, wasn't trying to build a following. They weren't asking for power, and yet power radiated from them like heat from a roaring fire. In a remote corner of Montana, Pastor Elijah Carter stood at his pulpit, his congregation silent as they waited for his words. "We chase answers," he said softly, his voice filling the wooden chapel. "We chase explanations, control, and clarity because we're afraid of what happens if we admit we don't understand." He paused, looking out at the faces in front of him, faces filled with fear, hope, and something close to desperation. But what if understanding isn't the point? What if the chosen one isn't here to explain anything but to show us something, to remind us of the pieces of ourselves we've buried under pride, greed, and fear? The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of unspoken questions, quiet prayers, and the hum of something ancient and sacred. Somewhere far from microphones and cameras, the chosen one walked unnoticed down a dusty road. A small child ran past them, chasing a butterfly with unfiltered joy. The chosen one smiled faintly, their steps steady, their presence as undeniable as the sun breaking through heavy clouds. The truth they carried couldn't be contained. It couldn't be simplified into sound bites or weaponized by politicians. It wasn't something that could be owned. But the world wasn't ready for that. People wanted answers, control, and clarity. And the chosen one offered none of those things. They offered something harder, something deeper, a mirror. In every heart they touched, in every fleeting glance and unspoken moment, they reflected back the raw, unfiltered truth about humanity, the good, the broken, the beautiful, and the flawed. And in that reflection, people found both fear and hope. But one question loomed larger than all the rest. What happens when the world realizes it can't contain the truth? The world had tried to define the chosen one, to box them in with theories, symbols, and narratives, but every attempt to contain their essence slipped through humanity's fingers like sand in the wind. The chosen one was not here to be owned, explained, or even understood. They were here to reveal. But what they revealed wasn't something external. It was something within. In a dimly lit hospital room in Denver, Dr. Amelia Grant, a seasoned physician with tired eyes and steady hands, sat at the bedside of a terminally ill patient. The man, Frank Delaney, had been fighting cancer for 2 years, and tonight was likely his last. "Doc," Frank said weakly, his voice a faint whisper against the hum of machines. Do you think it's all been worth it? My life, I mean." Dr. Grant hesitated, her hand gently resting on his frail shoulder. "Frank, worth isn't measured by what we leave behind. It's measured by how we lived while we were here." Frank closed his eyes, a tear slipping down his sunken cheek. I wish I had more time to figure it out." In the silence that followed, Dr. Grant thought of the image of the chosen one. She had stared at it many nights after her shifts, searching for something, an answer, a reassurance, maybe even redemption. But all she had found was a quiet reflection of herself, her doubts, her fears, and her hopes. Elsewhere, in a bustling subway station in New York, Jasmine Clark, a struggling musician with dreams too heavy for her thin shoulders, played her violin in the corner of the platform. Commuters rushed past her, their faces blurred with exhaustion and indifference. But tonight felt different. A stranger stood at the edge of the platform, hands in their pockets, head tilted slightly as they listened to Jasmine play. They didn't move, didn't speak, but their presence was undeniable. Jasmine felt her hands tremble as she played her final note, tears brimming in her tired eyes. When she looked up, the stranger was gone. But in her violin case lay a single folded note. "Your music matters. Don't stop playing." Jasmine clutched the note to her chest, her heart hammering with something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. The chosen one wasn't here to hand out miracles or grand revelations. They weren't prophets delivering commandments or revolutionaries leading uprisings. Instead, they seemed to amplify something that had always been there, hidden truths buried deep within people's hearts. In a dusty motel room on the outskirts of Phoenix, Ethan Caldwell, the journalist who first captured the chosen one's image, stared at his camera. The world had spiraled into chaos because of a single moment he had frozen in time, a moment he still couldn't fully explain. Maria Torres sat cross-legged on the floor beside him, flipping through photos on her tablet. "You know what's strange, Ethan," she said softly. "Everywhere we've looked, everywhere we've chased them, the people who've truly felt the chosen one didn't need proof. They just knew." Ethan nodded slowly, his brow furrowed. "It's like they weren't looking for answers. They were looking for permission. Permission to feel, to believe, to let go of whatever's been holding them back." The world was still chasing the chosen one, still trying to hold their presence in clenched fists. But those who truly saw them, those who truly felt them, weren't the ones shouting in debates or scouring maps. They were the quiet ones, the nurse in Denver, the violinist in New York, the pastor in Montana, people who carried silent burdens, unspoken dreams, and fragile hopes. Somewhere in a crowded plaza in Lisbon, the chosen one sat on a stone bench watching people pass by. A child toddled over to them, her laughter ringing out like a bell. The chosen one smiled, their eyes crinkling softly at the corners. A woman nearby, Isabella Reyes, paused mid-step. Her breath caught in her throat as she watched the interaction, her heart inexplicably tight. She didn't take a photo, didn't approach them. She simply watched, tears welling in her eyes. The truth the chosen one carried wasn't loud or grand. It was quiet. It was a whisper in the chaos, a moment of stillness in a rushing world. They weren't here to give people answers. They were here to remind people that the answers had been inside them all along. But humanity wasn't ready for such simplicity. The world still wanted grand revelations, dramatic transformations, and heroes who could fix everything. The chosen one offered none of that. Instead, they offered something far harder, a mirror held up to the soul. And as more and more people came face to face with that mirror, one undeniable truth began to sink in. The real search wasn't for the chosen one. It was for themselves. The presence of the chosen one had become more than a fleeting moment. It was now a seed planted deep within the hearts of those who had felt it. And, like all seeds, it began to grow. But growth is rarely gentle. Transformation is often born from discomfort, and the chosen one's quiet truth had stirred something raw and fragile in the hearts of millions. In a small town in Kentucky, Jordan Miller, a factory worker with grease-stained hands and hollow eyes, sat in his old pickup truck during his lunch break. The photo of the chosen one was propped against the dashboard, a worn, printed copy he carried with him everywhere. He stared at it, his calloused fingers trembling slightly. "They make me feel like I'm supposed to do something," Jordan muttered to himself. "But what? I'm just me." A knock on the window startled him. It was Laura, his coworker, holding a sandwich in one hand and a worried expression on her face. "Jordan, you okay?" she asked softly. He hesitated, then looked back at the photo. "Do you ever feel like there's something more you're supposed to be doing? Like we're all asleep, and they're trying to wake us up?" Laura's eyes glistened as she nodded. "Every day." Thousands of miles away in Mumbai, Meera Patel, a young activist, stood in front of a crowd gathered in a dusty courtyard. The sun blazed overhead, but her voice was steady and clear. "We keep waiting for someone else to fix things. For leaders, for heroes, for miracles. But the Chosen One isn't here to save us. They're here to remind us that we can save ourselves." The crowd erupted in applause, but Mira's heart was pounding. Her words felt too big for her small frame, but they were the truth, and truth has a way of catching fire. In an upscale boardroom in Tokyo, Kenji Tanaka, the CEO of a multinational tech conglomerate, stared at his reflection in the glass windows overlooking the city skyline. The photo of the Chosen One sat on his desk, a stark contrast to the polished mahogany and sterile chrome that surrounded him. For years, Kenji had built empires on efficiency, productivity, and profit. But now, staring into the calm, unyielding eyes of the Chosen One, he felt empty. His assistant entered the room quietly. "Mr. Tanaka, the shareholders are waiting." Kenji's voice was barely above a whisper. "What does it mean to build, if we've forgotten why we build?" The Chosen One wasn't changing the world in grand, sweeping gestures. There were no armies, no revolutions, no chants echoing in the streets with their name. But their presence, their quiet, undeniable presence, was like a drop of ink in clear water. It spread, permeated, and colored everything it touched. In Chicago, Professor Oliver Raines stood before his final lecture hall, filled with eager students. His voice was steady, but his hands shook slightly as he clutched his lecture notes. "We've spent our lives chasing knowledge, building theories, and defining truths. But what if the most important answers aren't written in books or carved into stone? What if they're carried in moments, in glances, in silence?" He paused, meeting the gaze of a student in the front row, a young woman with tears pooling in her eyes. "The Chosen One isn't giving us answers. They're giving us ourselves. And the question we must ask is, are we brave enough to listen?" The transformation wasn't loud, but it was everywhere. A father in South Africa knelt beside his son's bed and apologized for years of distance and silence. A scientist in Berlin set down her lab results and looked out the window, realizing she had been chasing certainty while ignoring wonder. A prisoner in Louisiana stared at the cracked ceiling of his cell and forgave himself for the first time in 20 years. The Chosen One wasn't leading people. They were showing people. And what they showed was simple yet profound. Change doesn't begin with the world. It begins within. In a quiet forest clearing somewhere far from cities and noise, the Chosen One sat cross-legged beneath a towering tree. Sunlight filtered through the branches, painting golden patterns on the ground. Birds sang softly in the distance, and the air was thick with stillness. A teenage girl named Ellie, lost and disoriented, stumbled into the clearing. Her backpack was torn, and her face streaked with dirt and tears. She froze when she saw the Chosen One sitting there, calm and still. Ellie didn't speak. She simply dropped to her knees, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The Chosen One said nothing, did nothing. They simply were. But in that silence, Ellie felt seen. Truly, deeply seen. When she finally stood and walked away, she left the clearing with her head held higher and her heart beating steadier. The Chosen One's power wasn't in their words or their actions. It was in their presence. And as that presence continued to ripple outward, one undeniable truth became clear. The Chosen One wasn't here to change the world for us. They were here to remind us that we have the power to change it ourselves. The Chosen One had never asked for a following, yet their presence had become a spark that set hearts, minds, and entire societies alight. It began quietly, in dimly lit rooms, in solitary moments of clarity, and in whispered confessions. But now it was impossible to ignore. Across the globe, something was shifting. In a packed auditorium in London, Professor Oliver Raines stood at a podium. His voice trembled slightly as he addressed hundreds of students and scholars. We have spent centuries building systems, economic, political, social, thinking they would give us meaning, security, and purpose. But the Chosen One, they've shown us that the most important structures are not made of steel or laws. They are made of hearts. Applause erupted, but Oliver wasn't speaking for praise. His words carried weight because they came from a place of truth. In Johannesburg, Meera Patel stood in front of thousands gathered in a city square. Her voice carried above the hum of the restless crowd. They didn't come here to save us. They came here to remind us of our power, our choices, and our responsibility to one another. Her words weren't just heard. They were felt. In every corner of the world, people began to act, not because they were told to, but because something inside them had shifted. A group of volunteers in Rio de Janeiro rebuilt a crumbling orphanage with their bare hands. In Tokyo, executives from rival corporations sat at a shared table, discussing ways to reduce environmental impact instead of maximizing profit margins. In a small diner in Ohio, Ava Bennett, the college waitress who once wondered why people resisted the Chosen One, stood up in the middle of her shift. She cleared her throat, her voice trembling as she addressed the customers. I don't know what comes next. I don't have all the answers. But I know one thing. The world doesn't have to stay the way it is. We can. We must do better. The diner went quiet, and then, one by one, customers began nodding, murmuring agreements, leaving larger tips for staff, and exchanging genuine smiles with strangers. It was happening, not in grand revolutions or sweeping declarations, but in small, quiet moments. The awakening was personal, yet universal. But the awakening wasn't welcomed by everyone. In a darkened room in Washington, D.C., Leonard Hayes watched a screen filled with news broadcasts showing the Chosen One's growing influence. His face was tight with frustration, his fists clenched. They're destabilizing everything, he growled. People are questioning authority, questioning systems we've spent decades building. One of his advisors, Richard Green, cleared his throat nervously. But, sir, they're not inciting rebellion. They're not even speaking. People are just changing. That's the problem, Leonard snapped. When people start changing from within, they become unpredictable. And unpredictable people are dangerous. But it was too late. The ripple had become a wave, and the wave had become a tide. In Paris, a young artist painted a mural of the Chosen One on the side of an old cathedral. But instead of depicting them as a divine figure, they painted them surrounded by ordinary people, workers, students, mothers, fathers, each carrying a faint glow in their chest. The message was clear. The light wasn't in the Chosen One. It was in everyone. Back in Seattle, Grace Evans, the high school teacher, stood in front of her classroom. The photo of the Chosen One was still pinned to the corner of her whiteboard. Class, she said softly, her voice steady despite the emotion in her chest. We've spent weeks talking about them, about what they mean, about what they represent. But I want to ask you something different today. What do you see in yourself when you look at them? The students were silent at first, and then, slowly, hands began to raise. A shy girl in the back said, I see. Courage, like I could do something brave if I tried. A boy near the window whispered, I see someone who forgives me, even when I can't forgive myself. Grace smiled, her throat tight with emotion. And That is the real miracle, isn't it? The Chosen One had become a mirror for humanity, not just reflecting what was broken, but what was possible. Somewhere far from all the noise, the debates, the crowds, and the headlines, the Chosen One walked. They moved through fields of wildflowers, past quiet rivers, and along empty roads. They didn't carry banners. They didn't raise their voice. They simply were. But their presence had become a catalyst, a spark that had caught fire in hearts across the world. People weren't waiting anymore. They weren't looking up to skyscrapers or searching in distant horizons for saviors. They were looking inward, and in that stillness they began to understand. The power they had been searching for had been inside them all along. The world was changing, not because of the Chosen One, but because of the truth they had revealed, and for the first time in a long time, hope felt less like a distant dream and more like a tangible, living force. The world wasn't loud anymore. The shouting debates on television screens had grown quieter. The angry protests and fiery speeches had started to fade, not because people stopped caring, but because something deeper had begun to take root, a silent revolution. This wasn't a revolution of banners and marches. It was a revolution of being. In homes, in classrooms, in boardrooms, and on factory floors, people were changing. The Chosen One hadn't handed down laws or commandments, hadn't spoken words of grand authority, and yet their presence had woven itself into the fabric of humanity, thread by golden thread. In a quiet corner of a small bookstore in Portland, Evelyn Myers, the retired nurse, sat with a group of strangers. They met once a week now, not to discuss politics or argue over the latest viral headline, but to share stories. "I spent most of my life waiting for someone to tell me what to do," Evelyn said, her voice trembling slightly. "But now, I think I'm starting to understand. The answers were never out there. They were always here." She placed a hand over her heart. The group sat in silence for a moment, and in that silence something sacred passed between them. A mutual understanding, fragile yet unbreakable. Thousands of miles away, in a massive corporate office in Dubai, Kenji Tanaka stood before his board of directors. The walls of the conference room glistened with polished steel and glass, but Kenji's voice carried the weight of something ancient and true. "We've built empires out of fear and scarcity," he said calmly, his hands resting on the sleek surface of the table. "But fear cannot build a future worth living in. From today, this company will measure its success not by profit margins, but by the impact we leave on people's lives." There were murmurs, looks of confusion, even resistance. But Kenji didn't waver. The Chosen One had shown him something he couldn't unsee, the power of choice. Meanwhile, in a small high school classroom in Seattle, Grace Evans was sitting cross-legged on the floor with her students. There were no desks between them, no barriers. "Close your eyes," she said softly. "Take a deep breath. I want you to think about one thing you wish you could change about the world." The room fell silent except for the sound of steady breathing. And in that stillness, something profound began to stir. Not in the air, but in each young heart sitting in that circle. But not everyone embraced the silence. In a hidden conference room beneath Washington, D.C., Leonard Hayes stood before a digital map glowing with red dots, each one representing a sighting, a ripple, a moment. "They're still out there," he said, his voice sharp and cold, "walking freely, spreading. Whatever this is, we need to contain them, control them." "But sir," Richard Green, his advisor, said cautiously, "people aren't following them. They're changing on their own. How do you stop an idea that isn't spoken but felt?" Leonard's face was pale with frustration. "You cut it off at the root." But the revolution wasn't something you could cut, burn, or bury. It was growing in the spaces between words, in the moments of eye contact between strangers, in the quiet decisions people made every day, to be kinder, to listen more, to forgive, to let go. In a remote cabin nestled in the snowy woods of Canada, Samantha, the waitress from Atlanta, sat by a crackling fire. The note she had received, the one that said, "Your music matters. Don't stop playing," was tucked safely in her journal. She pulled out her violin and began to play. The melody was soft, haunting, and filled with longing. Outside, the snow fell gently, and the world felt still. And somewhere in a bustling market square in Morocco, the chosen one stood quietly, watching people go about their lives. They weren't recognized, weren't stopped or questioned. They simply watched. A young girl selling handmade bracelets noticed them and hesitated. Her dark eyes met the chosen one's gaze, and she felt something stir deep inside her chest. A warmth, a knowing. Without a word, she walked over and handed them one of her bracelets. "For you," she said softly. The chosen one smiled, a small, quiet smile that carried the weight of 1,000 lifetimes. The world wasn't louder because of them. It was quieter. And in that quiet, people were beginning to hear themselves again. In bustling cities and quiet villages, on crowded trains and empty fields, the same questions began to bloom in countless hearts. What if I stopped waiting? What if I stopped being afraid? What if I started right now? The revolution wasn't televised. It wasn't announced with grand speeches or banners waving in the wind. It was in the father who decided to go home early and have dinner with his kids. It was in the young man who put down his phone and had an honest conversation with his mother. It was in the stranger who paid for someone else's meal without expecting anything in return. The chosen one had become less of a person and more of a presence. They were now an idea, a question, a choice. Somewhere far from the noise of headlines and broadcast debates, the chosen one walked, unseen, unknown, but undeniably felt. And the world, slowly but surely, was beginning to change. Not because of them, but because of us. The world had not ended, nor had it been reborn in a blaze of light. There were no trumpets in the sky, no grand finale to mark the conclusion of the chosen one's journey. Instead, the change seeped quietly into the cracks of society, like water finding its way through stone. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet undeniable. In a hospital room in Denver, Dr. Amelia Grant stood at the bedside of a new mother cradling her infant. The soft glow of dawn seeped through the blinds. The mother, tears tracing lines down her cheeks, looked up at Amelia and whispered, "I'm going to be better. I don't know how, but I will." Amelia nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She'd seen hundreds of births, but this one felt different. There was hope here, not the fragile kind that breaks under the weight of fear, but something resilient, something true. In a noisy subway in New York City, Jasmine Clark stood with her violin. The music she played wasn't just a melody, it was a thread pulling strangers together in a moment of shared stillness. Commuters paused mid-step, faces softening as the notes hung in the air. When Jasmine stopped playing, a man in a rumpled suit stepped forward, tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he said simply. In Washington, D.C., Leonard Hayes sat in his darkened office, his hands trembling as he held a glass of whiskey. His empire, built on control and fear, was beginning to fracture. Not from rebellion, but from something gentler and far more powerful: understanding. His advisor, Richard Green, stood at the doorway, watching him with quiet pity. "You can't stop it, Leonard. You can't fight what's already inside people's hearts." Leonard closed his eyes, his shoulders sagging with the weight of surrender. Across the ocean, in the streets of Cairo, Mira Patel knelt beside a young girl who had scraped her knee. With gentle hands, Mira cleaned the wound and offered a smile. "You'll be okay," she said softly. The girl sniffled, her tears fading into a shy smile. And in that fleeting moment, a bridge was built, one made of kindness and quiet strength. In a classroom in Seattle, Grace Evans watched as her students worked on their final essays. The prompt on the board read, "What does it mean to be truly awake?" One by one, the students handed in their papers. Grace held the stack close to her chest, knowing these words carried something fragile, something real. The Chosen One had not given speeches or started a movement. They hadn't raised armies or toppled governments. They had simply been. And in their stillness, they had become a mirror, showing humanity what had been hidden in plain sight all along. In a quiet chapel in Montana, Pastor Elijah Carter stood before his congregation. His voice was calm, steady, but thick with emotion. The Chosen One didn't come to save us from ourselves. They came to show us that we never needed saving, just reminding. He paused, his eyes scanning the faces before him. Each of us carries a spark of something divine, something powerful. And the greatest act of faith isn't waiting for someone else to change the world. It's having the courage to change yourself. Meanwhile, far from the world's attention, the Chosen One stood at the edge of a quiet lake, their reflection shimmering on the water's surface. The air was still, the sky painted in soft hues of orange and pink. Orange and pink. A child, no older than 6, wandered up beside them. She was barefoot, her dress stained with grass and mud. "Are you leaving?" she asked softly, her eyes wide and curious. The Chosen One knelt down so they were eye level with the girl. Their smile was gentle, their eyes deep with something timeless and kind. "I was never really here. And yet, I've always been here." The child tilted her head, trying to understand, but instead of asking more questions, she simply nodded. The Chosen One stood, their gaze lingering on the horizon before they turned and walked away, one step at a time, until they were nothing more than a silhouette against the fading light. The world didn't stop turning when the Chosen One disappeared from sight. The sun rose the next day, and people went about their lives. But things were different. In the quiet corners of coffee shops, strangers made eye contact and exchanged warm smiles. On factory floors and office desks, people paused to breathe, to feel, before rushing into their next task. In classrooms, homes, and places of worship, conversations became more open, more honest, more real. It wasn't a utopia. People still argued, still made mistakes, still stumbled over their own flaws, but something had shifted. A woman in Nebraska whispered to her newborn child, "You're going to grow up in a world where people remember to care for each other." A man in Paris, looking at the mural of the Chosen One, placed his hand over his heart and whispered, "Thank you." The Chosen One was gone, but their presence remained, woven into the fabric of humanity, in the quiet moments, in the unspoken choices, in the small acts of courage and kindness that shaped the world each day. The world had not been saved, but perhaps it had been awakened. And in that awakening, humanity took its first trembling steps, not toward perfection, but toward possibility. The end was not an end at all. It was a beginning,